just turned it on. All I have to do is get my PowerPoint up and we'll be ready to go. Okay. How's everybody doing? Are we projected? Yes. Okay. Let's go. Talk to you about the coming kingdom. You know, my professor in Bible school told me, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. This is, I think, the 33rd Christmas message I've spoken since I've been here. I got here in 1989, and I've not repeated anything. So I have something new for you tonight. I want to talk to you about the coming kingdom. And so I'm going to use a very familiar story from the Christmas story, but I'm going to give you the backstory tonight. And I'm going to tell you how God planned from the beginning for the birth of Jesus, and how he told the people over the centuries of the Messiah that is coming. And the scriptures are actually 66 different books, and they were written over a period of 2,000 years. And so there's a lot of different genres of literature, but throughout the scriptures, we see the promise of the coming of the Messiah of the Jews. So I want to talk to you about the coming of the kingdom, why it's important, and how God used the kingdom of Rome to accomplish his purposes. So let me get my slideshow going here. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. Now, I know it says in the King James Version that all the world should be taxed, but all of the modern translations translate this, that they should be registered. And registration, you know, in New York State, they register guns, but they don't register people. And in Pennsylvania, they register people, but they don't register guns. There are certain things that need to be registered. And so it says here the Emperor Augustus, and I don't know how much you know about Roman history, but Rome started out as a representative republic, and it turned into an empire with an emperor. And this occurred, you know, not too many years before Jesus was born. And so in those days, a decree went out, and he said, I want to know who's out there. I want to know who's on my side. I want to know who I can conscript in my army. I want to know who I can tax. And so he decided to make sure that everybody had to go and be registered. So a census is a recorded historical event. So here's the backstory. God was working on the birth of Jesus for a very long time. Next slide, please. I want to talk to you about this passage about King David 1,000 years BC. You know, the Old Testament goes 2,000 or more years before Christ, which is just as long before as we are living afterwards. And so about 1,000 years BC, there was a kingdom, and there was a great king named David, and David decided that he wanted to build a temple in Jerusalem for God. And God said to him through the prophet, no, you're a warrior, you're a killer, you can't build a temple for me. I will build a temple for you. And so throughout the Old Testament, people were waiting for this event that's in this particular passage. He will build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So David was told that sometime in the future, there would be a descendant from him who would have a forever kingdom. So this was about 1,000 years BC. So God is working on it even before. Have you ever thought that God is not on time? Well, God wasn't on time for people that lived between the time of David and the time of Jesus, but God had a plan. Next slide, please. Later, sometime more than 200 years before Christ, the prophet Daniel had a vision. And in this vision, he says, I watched in the night visions. I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient of Days, the Ancient One, and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Dominion is an everlasting dominion. It shall not pass away. His kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. And so in our narrative concerning the birth of Christ, we have the Roman world king, the emperor, making a decree, and that decree caused this forever king to be born in a place that another prophet said the Messiah would be born, that is, in the city of Bethlehem. Now, census, next slide please. Census is a way of government control. Now, you can find out a lot of stuff from a census. For instance, do you know where the Burning Spring is over in Bristol? Familiar with it? It was on the most ancient maps when the Europeans came here. The gas comes up through the creek, and in those days, in the 1600s, it can burn continually because there was a lot of it in that time. And when the French came here, the Indians brought them to the Burning Spring. Well, back in about 1795, my first ancestors came here and they purchased that property. And the person's name was Jonathan Case. And Jonathan had a son, and he had a son, Oliver Case, who was the New York State Assemblyman. And he had a son, and he had a son, and he had a son, and he had a daughter, and that was my great-grandmother. And the reason that I can tell this story is because all I have to do is go back and look at the census. A lot of times it tells how old people are, who's living in the house, and you can find out, if kids die over a 10-year period. If you find out if the husband died during a 10-year period, you can go to the archives and you can look up all the deeds. And I can trace back to the earliest white settlers in this area because of the fact that we have a census. And it certainly was important for the believability of the story that there be a census, because Jesus was raised in another place with a little bit different accent, and when he was out ministering, some of the people who were against him said, look in the scriptures to see that no prophet comes from Nazareth. But all they had to do was look in the census, and they could see that Jesus was born in the exact same place that the prophet said he would be born. And I don't know how long the Roman census lasted where you could look it up, but I do know that there's a census right down here in the Ontario County Archives that goes back, more than 200 years. And so if people could say Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem like the scripture said, it could be proven that Jesus actually was born there. So we have a decree from an emperor named Augustus. August is named after this guy and after his descendants. It means the great one. And so Augustus is the nephew of Caesar, who was the first citizen among all citizens. Now we have an emperor who's in charge. This is a political situation where this guy has grabbed control of everything. And from this time on, Rome became ruled by an emperor and not by the votes of the citizen. And so he says that everybody should be registered. Next slide. Here is my Social Security card. Notice that the numbers are blotted out. This says my address is 40 Main Street, East Bloomfield, so I know that I received this after the age of 7, because I lived down here in Canandaigua Lake. I lived in Victor, then at Canandaigua Lake, and then when I was 7, I moved to Bloomfield, and so we have a 40 Main Street address, which is the old Main Street before Holcomb and East Bloomfield were combined and became the village of Bloomfield. And so I know from this that my mother, can't imagine my father did it, I know that my mother applied for my Social Security card. She registered me for Social Security. And on the bottom, I don't know if you can see it on the thing, but it says, for Social Security and tax purposes, not for identification. Is it being used for identification? Absolutely. You can't do anything. You can't get a bank loan. You can't do anything without your Social Security number. But when they first issued them, they said, no, we're not trying to give everybody a number. And there were a lot of people who said, I want my privacy. I don't want to be identified by a number, and I don't want the government knowing throughout my whole life exactly where this person is. They said, no, it's not for identification. Now, the new cards don't say that. The new cards just say Social Security Administration, because they want it, it's an incrementalism. The government uses incrementalism. Here, the emperor is trying to get control of all of these people who he believes belong to him, and he believes that the money in their pocket should be given to him and given to his empire. And so he decides to have a census, which forces Jesus to be born in the place where the prophet says that he would be born. Now let's look at this next slide. You know what this is? You older people will know what it is. This is a draft card. This is my draft card. My number was, or is, 30, 68, 55, 184. And I am just at the age where the people that were 1 year older than me were still being drafted into Vietnam. And so when they said, when you're 18 years old, you have to register for the draft. And so I went down on May 1st, which was 2 days after my 18th birthday, and I registered for the draft. And if I had not done so, I would have been fined. And in those days, the drinking age was 18. And if you did not have a draft card, you could not get into a bar. Years and years later, I didn't drink any alcohol for many, many years. And years later, I went to get a bottle of wine or something, and they said, can I have some ID? So I still looked young enough to maybe need ID. And I showed them my draft card, and they said, we can't take this. It used to be that this was the only thing that they would take. So we have to register for certain things. And the government knows, they know my date of birth from this. And the interesting thing is, my weight at that time was 135. At age 18, 135. So they knew my eye color, they knew my hair color, they knew my height. These things weren't on the Social Security card. Now, when my kids were born, I think we had to get them Social Security cards from their birth. I think that the hospital does it now. So they know everything about everybody. And that's the reason that Augustus wanted everybody to go and register, so he could see who was for him, who was against him. But it turned out that it made it so that Jesus was born in the place that the Bible said he would be born, which I think is really amazing. Next slide. The genealogies of Joseph and Mary, the Jews were they were like Mormons. They followed the genealogy. They kept track of who was descended from who. And the complete genealogy of Joseph is in Matthew chapter 1, and the complete genealogy of Mary is in Luke chapter 3. Because the author of the scriptures wanted to prove that Jesus was actually descended from David, because that's what the prophet said. And 1 Samuel, it mentions David 1,000 years BC. He was the son of an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse. Next slide, please. So we have people from Nazareth who spoke a different dialect. You'll remember that when Jesus was being arrested, the people in Jerusalem were able to identify Peter and the other disciples by the way they spoke. They lived far enough away so that they had a different accent. Not so much anymore, but we can certainly tell somebody that's from Texas, or Mark is from Pennsylvania there, and I could even tell a Pennsylvania accent because it's a little different. And our accent is really unique in throughout the country. People, when I was in the South, they had no idea where I was from because this area, we have very strong R's. And I would say to them, I'm going to cook a steak on the grill, and they thought that I was saying I was going to cook a steak on a girl. That's a pretty hot girl. So in biblical times, Nazareth and Bethlehem are 90 miles apart. And so today it's about 70 miles because they have roads and, they go through parts of the mountain and they've cut it down some. But can you imagine, any of you ladies who've had a child, can you imagine just days, 3, 4, or 5 days before you've given birth, that you walked 90 miles through the mountain? Can you imagine what that must have done to Mary? But the prophet said, you, Bethlehem, are one of the little clans. From you shall come forth one from me who is to rule Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. This is not somebody that's born this Christmas morning. This is somebody who's existed from all time and will exist for all time. The scripture clearly points out that Jesus would be born there. Next slide. So he went to be registered, that's Joseph, with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. Now, I've seen 7 children born. I never was able to find another woman besides my wife that would let me watch that. But I've seen all these kids born, and it's really quite an event. It starts, and there's contractions, and they get closer and closer, and then eventually your wife starts to curse you.
I can do that without delivering.
This is your fault. She said that to me every time. So he went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. Next slide. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. No midwife. No orange disinfectant. What is that? What is that orange stuff that they... It's like it looks like iodine or something. Is that what it is? The same family. No epidural. No episiotomy. No heat. No stirrups. No clean water. No privacy. No incubator. No bed. No antibiotics. In a strange place that she probably has never been before. Seems like pretty mean of God in one way, but he seems to know what he's doing. And next slide, she wrapped him in bands of cloth. That means they went around and they found from the different houses around there, do you have any rags that I can wrap my baby up with? It was a rough situation. Next slide. She gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth, laid him in a manger because there was no place in the inn. Why was there no place in the inn? Because they got there late. Only so many hotel rooms in Bethlehem in the first century. And because the Caesar had said everybody has to go back to their hometown, I'm sure the restaurant business and the business of hotels thought, Caesar's the greatest guy in the world. Look at all this business he's giving us. No matter where it was, that hotels were booked packed up full, and they could gouge people a little bit. And they got there, and there was no place for them to stay. It doesn't say they didn't have the money to stay. It says there's just no place for them. And so they put Jesus in a feed trough. It doesn't say that he was born in a stable. Now, you could say, well, feed trough would be found in a stable. Well, perhaps. But it doesn't say that. Maybe it implies it. So they just found a little place where they could put him in and he wouldn't roll out. And he had some old clothes on him, some old cloth on him. And that's how Jesus got his life. That's how Jesus' life began. It was not ideal. Can you imagine if you were such a woman that had to go through these kind of things in order to bring Jesus into the world? You would think that God would say, okay, I'll send Jesus through the king's house, and he'll be pampered, and he'll have everything that he needs. He'll have all the best food. He'll have nursemaids and all these things. But no, he was born in Bethlehem with no amenities in life whatsoever. Next slide. So I'd like to point out that Caesar Augustus's decree, along with Joseph and Mary's obedience, registered the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem in the records of Rome. Nobody could deny that he was born there. Next slide. A new everlasting king requires a new census. It says in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, if you conquer, you will be clothed in white robes. I will not blot your name out of the book of life. I will confess your name before my Father and before his angels. Is your name written in the book? Have you enrolled in the census of the newborn king? This is really the question which is before all of humanity, because this new king is not just king of the Jews, he's the king of all the people everywhere. So is your name in the book? May God bless you. May you have a Merry Christmas.